Chapter 43. The evening turned into night, and the night into the coming day. And it was another good one. The people of the borough prepared to go about their business without any particular interest. Tomorrow was coming, the great day of the games, and they all had their free tickets. Well, almost all. Old Pete waved goodbye to a well-pleased punter and pecked his old lips at the bulging bundle of money notes he now clutched in his grubby paw.
"Enjoy yourself," he called. "Come on, the beast."
Norman had been up most of the night tinkering in his lock-up garage, and the Hartnell air car was coming on a storm. He had definitely come up with a winner this time. As the dawn broke on the black horizon, he yawned, scratched his bum, locked up the garage, and trudged back to his shop for an hour or two shut-eye. Neville did not rise like a lark, more like a turkey on Christmas Eve. He had a bad feeling that he could not put a name to. Something was very wrong in the borough. His nose told him so. But exactly what, that was anyone's guess.
"Probably nothing,"
said the part-time barman as he lay in wait for Norman's paperboy, pointed stick in hand. Jim lay long in bed, nursing a hangover of extreme proportions. When the cabbage wine had gone, he had done the unthinkable and broken into O'Malley's hut, wherein lay a half-crate of 5-year-old Scotch.
"If he is dead," Pulley reasoned, "he will forgive me. If alive, then I can always apologise."
Such reasoning had got Pulley where he was today, wherever that might have been. The professor looked in at his door.
"Sleep on, sweet prince," he said softly. "You are going to need all the strength you have."
Inspector Horvis had had a rough night. It had all been in newspaper headlines again, each announcing in big black letters the sacking in great disgrace of the great detective. His commander had given him 24 hours to wind up his investigations, arrest the master criminals, and recover the gold. Horvis awoke in a cold sweat to the sound of his telephone ringing.
"It must be tonight," said the voice of Hugo Rune. "Be ready."
Horvis replaced the receiver. His number was unlisted. He had not given it to Rune.
"Tonight," said Inspector Horvis. "Tonight." "And this is the London Olympics," said the television set. "And off you go," said Neville, pulling the plug.
Young Master Robert danced before him in a youthful delirium.
"That is for the benefit of the punters," he cried. "Switch it back on this minute."
Neville gazed round at the deserted bar.
"Why don't you get stuffed?"
he inquired beneath his breath.
"Your job's on the line here, pal," bawled the bouncing boy. "Get it back on, that's an order." "As you please."
Neville inserted the plug in its socket. He could have found a far better place to stick it.
"And to what do I owe this pleasure?" he asked. "You useless skinny turd," said the young master. "You and your paddy mate thought you got the better of me, didn't you? Thought you could wind me up, eh?" "No offence meant," said Neville. "None taken, I hope." "Do you see this?"
The boy waggled an official-looking document beneath the barman's nose. Neville did not like the smell of it.
"See it, dear?" "I think I can just about make it out." "We'll take a good long look."
He spread the paper out upon the bar top.
"Peruse and inwardly digest."
Neville cocked his good eye over it, firstly with disinterest, then with amazement, latterly with horror.
"You are selling the Swan?"
he whispered in a creaking, breathless voice.
"Yes, indeedy. This dump never made a decent profit, most likely because your round is always in the till."
Neville took the greatest exception to that remark, but he was dumbstruck.
"Well, now you can do the other thing. We're selling it off. The brewery is diversifying, expanding into other areas, leisure complexes, recreational facilities, the growth market of tomorrow. These old spit and sawdust pubs are a thing of the past. The Swan is finished. You are finished."
Neville's brain swam in soup.
"You? What?" "What's your mate, Neville?"
said Jim Pulley, who, upon rising from his pit, knew exactly where he should take his breakfast.
Jim,
said Neville.
Jim.
Jim spied the barman's grave demeanour. Something up? He asked, astute as ever.
He's just about to get his coat on and go down to the job centre,
said young Master Robert.
He's what?
Jim looked at Neville.
What is all this? Not that it's any of your business, said the boy, but this scrawny excuse for a barman is getting the elbow.
You are sacking Neville. Pulley shook his head in order to wake up his brain. He surely hadn't had that much to drink last night, but perhaps he had. Perhaps he was having the DTs.
Sacking Neville. He's out. The brewery is selling the Swan. Selling it. For how much?
The young master turned the property details, for such they were, about on the bar top.
£75,000, more than it's worth.
And when does it go on the market?
End of the week.
Interested, are you? He asked sarcastically.
You look like you could run to a sleeping bag and a quart of cider.
There are no witnesses, said Jim to Neville. Shall I kill him now? Neville hung his drowning head.
You know my feelings about murdering the bar.
This is a somewhat exceptional circumstance. We might waive the rule on this occasion.
You paranomarks, go screw yourselves.
With this parting shot, the young master stepped around the bar counter and drew himself a large scotch. Grinning like a dead moggy, he took his drink off to a distant table. Jim looked at the lost barman.
Golly,
said he.
The game will appear to be up,
the other replied.
Have a pint on the ass.
He took down a glass, stared through it wistfully, and placed it beneath the beer spout.
75,000, said Jim. Not an unreasonable sum, all things considered.
Well beyond my means.
Neville pulled upon the pump handle and presented Jim with his pint.
And yours also.
Pulley smiled.
Not necessarily. Have a little look at this, and take a large scotch for yourself.
Jim dug out his betting slip that the professor had just this morning returned to him and spread it before the barman. Neville looked at the slip. He looked at Pulley, at the slip, at the Scotch optic, at young Master Robert, at Pulley. Neville did a whole lot of looking.
So it's true,
he said in a whisper, appropriate to the occasion.
Is this a genuine article? I had talk, of course.
Jim nodded.
The real McCoys, I say.
Congratulations.
Neville was unable to muster a lot of conviction.
I mean, well done. I'm happy for you.
Come on, Neville, said Jim. It would be a great shame to see the Swan change hands or ever, God forbid, close down. It's kind of my past. I'd hate to see it go.
Then you.
Not me, Neville. You.
Me?
Of course.
Pulley grinned. A warm flush of pure pleasure crept all over his body.
This is your pub. You should own it. It is your right.
My right?
I give it to you as a present, said Jim, on the promise that you never change a thing. Not a hair of the carpet, not a tatty old bar stool, not a nothing. That you keep it as it always has been, forever.
I promise.
Neville crossed his heart.
You really mean it?
Jim dug a leaky biro from his pocket and wrote upon a beer mat. Neville, I owe you £75,000. Signed, Jim Pulley.
I'll be around 12 tomorrow with the money, God willing.
God willing.
There are a few matters that the professor and I have to sort out. Oh, and Neville, you will take down that silly sign, won't you? I always liked the Flying Swan, just as it was.
Oh, yes, Jim. Oh, yes, indeed.
Neville clutched the beer mat to his chest.
Tell me once again that this is really true.
It is really true, and why shouldn't it be? Every man should be entitled to his happy ever after. It's only fair.
Oh, yes, Jim. Yes, yes, yes.
Neville pulled the plug from the television set.
Time, gentlemen, please, he called. Come on now, gents. Have you got no homes to go to?
The young master leapt up from his seat and stormed across the bar.
Time, gentlemen, please. What's your game? Have you gone stone bonker mad?
Neville took up the soda-siphon and levelled it at the young tormentor.
Should I, Jim? What do you think?
Oh, you should, said Jim Pulley. You really should.
The Brentford sun moved across the sky, became a projected image for the balance of the day, dipped towards the horizon and made off towards foreign parts. Night fell upon Brentford. Neville sniffed at the air. It ponged like crazy, but a broad smile was on the face of that part-time barman as he tapped the top pocket which contained a certain signed beer mat.
"We will ceremonially burn that,"
he said, glancing at the ridiculous sign hanging outside the pub.
"Ye Flying Swan indeed."
"I don't think I can go through with this," said Neville's erstwhile saviour. "I don't think my bottle is up to it." Professor Slocum smiled.
"You will manage, Jim. My faith is in you."
"But what exactly are you intending to do?"
"Well, I must confess that Caliton has very much placed the cat amongst the pigeons by putting forward the start of the games. I am not as well prepared as I might like."
"We are doomed," said Jim.
"Nothing of the kind. The fact that he has done this suggests that he has doubts, fears that he will not succeed in his insane scheme."
"But what of it all? You can't be certain he isn't telling the truth."
"No, I cannot be certain. But the threat is palpable, and we must make all efforts to confound his plans."
"The soul of the world," said Pulley. "Some adversary."
"No, Jim, I will not have it. We now have the wherewithal to enter the stadium. We shall see what we shall see."
"Professor," said Jim seriously, "you have held your ceremonies here, upon home territory. I'm not a fool. I know that here you are at your strongest, your most powerful. But up there, out in the open, on Caliton's home pitch, we might not fare too well."
"Jim, do you understand what is meant by the balance of equipoise?"
"Like Newton's third law of motion, every force is an equal and opposing force, that kind of thing." The professor scratched at his chin.
"You are coming into your own, Jim."
"I have no idea what you mean," said Jim, although he knew that he did.
"Terrible forces rage and thrust. The universe is not a peaceful place, but the balance remains. One thing cancels out another. There is harmony. A universal plan exists."
"Good," said Pulley. "You are talking about good."
"If you put it in those terms, then yes, I am. Universal spirit, call it what you will. For every yes, there is a no. Two sides to every question. Without an overlying logic, there would be just chaos."
"I dare not think about the stars," said Jim.
"That is one of the most profound statements I have ever heard."
"It is?" Jim asked. "I have others if you wish to compile a list."
"Now is not the appropriate time. Perhaps tomorrow."
"If there is a tomorrow."
"Ah, said Professor Slocum. "Perk up, Jim. Here comes Biggles."
"What ho, chaps," said Norman Hartnell, thrusting his head through the French windows. "What you make, Norman?"
"Oh, dear me."
Jim made a painful face as the scientific shopkeeper stepped into the study. He was clad in a leather helmet, replete with the kind of goggles that would find favour with steampunks 30 years into the future. Little woolly explosions broke from his ancient RAF flying jacket. A silk scarf hung about his neck.
"Wizard Prang," said Norman Hartnell.
Professor Slocum glanced at Pulley. Jim made a brave face. In his left trouser pocket, a nubbin of fluff resembled the earlobe of the legendary Jack Palance. "Bear with him," said Jim. "He says it will work."
"And so it will, and does," said Norman. "Who's going up for a spin then?"
The professor placed instruments of his enigmatic trade into a Gladstone bag and snapped it shut.
"If we are all ready," said he.
Pulley took a deep breath. "All right," he said. "Let's go." The three men walked out into the night streets of Brentford. It seemed a clear night, peaceful, just like any other, but Jim and the professor knew to the contrary. Something lurked, a big bad troll waiting to gobble them all up. Norman marched ahead with a jaunty step. He just doesn't know, thought Pulley. But what if he did? What if everyone knew?
If things went badly tonight, and all was as Calaton had said, the world of men would soon be in for a dire shock, a rude awakening. All that was normal, all that was expected to be, all those plans and futures gone up in a puff of smoke, or a dirty great bang, or something.
Jim had no idea what, but whatever it was no laughing matter. Norman led them to the row of lock-up garages, amidst many a furtive sideways glance to assure himself that they were not to be observed. Amidst many more furtive sideways glances, he took out his ring of keys and applied one to the lock. The up and over door did that very thing, and Norman turned with a flurry of flapping arms.
"Your chariot awaits," said he.
The Morris miners stood, looking somewhat the worse for wear. Pulley and the Professor edged about it, peering and wondering. Strange metal carbuncles had been welded onto the bonnet, and a battery of commandeered flue pipes, vacuum cleaner nozzles, and shower sprinklers projected from beneath the boot. Metal hoses were strung across the car and secured to iron rings set into the concrete floor.
"Just to be on the safe side," said Norman to the Professor, who was eyeing these with suspicion. "Now, if you two gentlemen would like to sit in the back, I need quite a bit of space in the cockpit."
Pooley and the Professor climbed aboard, and Norman swung back the driving seat after them.
My, said Jim, that looks quite busy.
The dashboard of the Morris now bore a distinct resemblance to that of the Concorde, with rows of twinkling lights, gauges, dials, switches, and the like.
"Mostly for show," said Norman. "For the Japanese market. They love that kind of stuff."
He busied himself releasing the steel hoses, then climbed into the pilot's seat and slammed the door.
"Safety belt on," he said, buckling himself up. "Key ignition." He did that very thing. "Altitude check. 0 check. Thrust plates activated. Single interlock on. Normanite pods. Optimum factor 6. "Norman," said Professor Slocum sternly, "is all this pre-flight procedure actually necessary, or do I detect gamesmanship at work here?" "Safety first, Professor. As test pilot, it is my responsibility." "Test pilot," said Pulley. "You mean you haven't, actually flown this thing before?" "There has to be a first time for everything." "Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear."
Pulley would have flapped his hands wildly and spun about in small circles, but he was firmly wedged in a very small space.
"Oh, be quiet, Jim. Have you no sense of adventure? Here we go. Chucks away."
Norman revved the engine, engaged something which might have been a gear, but was probably far more complicated, and the car crept out of the lock-up and into the silent street. Norman placed his goggles over his eyes and leant back in his seat.
Up and away!
The car bumped down the curb and into the road, showing no immediate inclination towards taking flight.
Up and away!
The Morris continued up the street, the only upping it seemed to have in mind.
"Damn blast it," said Norman. "There seems to be a slight technical hitch."
Professor Slocum examined his pocket watch.
"We do not have all night," he said in a cold voice. "We are a bit overloaded," said the shopkeeper, "but no problem. There's a couple of paving slabs in the boot for ballast. I'll just have them out."
He pulled the vehicle over to the side of the road, switched off the ignition, withdrew the key, and climbed out of the car. Pulley noted that his safety belt had left with him, which was probably not an encouraging sign. The Professor was looking far from happy.
"Don't blame me," said Jim. "This is none of my doing."
"Won't be a tick." Norman threw open the boot and struggled with a paving slab. It tumbled into the road and fell with a loud thud. The mystery in that, thought Jim, is how it failed to do the obvious and land on his foot.
"Just one more and then we'll be off."
Jim suddenly realised that he seemed to be sitting much further back in his seat than before, and that the view through the windscreen seemed mostly sky.
"Norman," he shouted, turning and tapping on the rear window. "Norman, shan't be a tick, soon have it out."
This time the paving slab made a more muffled thump as it struck the ground.
"Oh, well," wailed Norman, hopping about on one foot. "Oh, well. Oh, no," howled Jim. "We're going up, Norman. Do something."
The shopkeeper hopped and swore. All four wheels of the car were now floating free of the road. The Hartnell air car was taken to its avowed natural habitat.
"Norman,
Suddenly realising the gravity, or in this case the non-gravity of the situation, Norman ceased his hopping and made a great leap at the rear bumper as it passed him by. He missed, floundered, and toppled into the road as where he lay, drumming his fists and kicking his feet and crying hell over and over and over again. The car began to gather speed and altitude in a direct mathematical ratio, which was of interest to the Professor alone. "I think you had better take over up front, Jim," said the old man. "I have never actually driven a car." "I've driven cars, but never one like this. And anyway, Jim? Anyway, Norman has the ignition key." "Ah," said Professor Slocum. "Now, this presents us with certain unique difficulties. We would appear to be gathering momentum at a rate inversely proportionate to that of a falling object. Thus we are gaining mass. This is interesting, as Newtonic law would naturally presuppose an invalidation in the anti-gravitational properties of Normanite. One should cancel the other out." "Fascinating," said Jim, growing sweaty about the brow. "Yes," said Professor Slocum, "but not good. If we continue to accelerate in this fashion, then I estimate we will strike the underside of the stadium." He did a rapid mental calculation. "In approximately 55 seconds, give or take. I would consider impact to be a somewhat messy affair, doubtless culminating in our extinction." Pulley got the message without further telling of it. He shinned over to the driver's seat and began to tear at the dashboard. "A bit of wire would be your man, Professor." "Ah, yes, a hot wire, I believe it is called. A sound idea." The Professor reached into a rip in the seat back in front of him, and with a display of remarkable strength ripped out a length of rusty spring. "Here you are, Jim. This should be the very thing." Pulley snatched the spring from the outstretched hand and delved into the dashboard. "How much time?" 30 seconds, probably less." Jim jiggled the spring and thrummed the accelerator pedal, and cursed a lot. Norman had done a thorough job in rewiring the car. He couldn't raise a spark. "It doesn't work," cried Jim. "It doesn't work." "How pity," said Professor Slocum. "It was a brave try, though." The car sped upwards, gaining speed. Far below, Norman watched it receding into the sky. He counted down the seconds beneath his breath and closed his eyes. If it was of any interest to anyone other than those personally involved in the impending disaster, his mental calculations tallied exactly with those of the Professor. A small task force of hand-picked officers crept along the Kew Road. Before them, two figures stalked from shadow to shadow, muttering to one another in urgent, muted tones. One was lean and angular, and had taken no sustenance whatever this day. The other was broad and bulbous, and had only recently pushed his chopsticks aside for a 12-course belly-buster.
"As commanding officer," said Inspector Horvis, "I dictate the naming of names. This is Operation Sherringford, and history will know us as Horvis's heroes."
"Phooey," the other replied. "As overall advisor on special attachment to the unit, I demand that this venture be called Operation Hugo, and we Rune's Raiders."
"I've no intention of arguing with you, Rune."
"Nor I you, Rune's Raiders, or I go home."
"All right, but it's Operation Sherringford."
"Ludicrous! Must I forever pander to your inflated ego?"
The two continued their dispute as they neared the gasometer. Behind them, the team of 5 officers slunk along. To them, this was Operation Laurel and Hardy, and they were the Lost Patrol.
"All right, Rune," whispered Horvis, as the two of them skulked in the shadows. "We're getting close now. What is the plan?"
"Plan?" asked Hugo Rune.
"Plan, man. You do have one, don't you?"
"Do you mean the plan for Operation Hugo, or that other one?" Horvis muttered beneath his breath. No matter what the outcome of this operation was, he had determined that Rune's immediate future was going to be subject to the pleasure of Her Majesty. "Which?" asked Hugo Rune.
"Operation Hugo,"
spat Inspector Horvis. "Good," said Rune. "Now, follow me." He led Horvis on, and the inspector beckoned the task force to follow. Rune's raiders skirted the wire fence. It towered above them menacingly. Tiny blue sparkles of electrical energy fizzed and popped about its upper regions, saying, "Just you try it."
"I hope you know what you're doing,"
Hovis growled as the field of static set the inspector's whitened pelt on end. Rune strode forcefully on ahead, in case Hovis spotted the hopeless look on his face. If he couldn't come up with a means of entry soon, he was going to have to do a runner. The fence was endless, threatening. He plodded on, casting spells in every direction. Suddenly, he halted in his tracks, and a broad smile broke out upon his broad face. "There," said he in a hushed voice. Hovis collided with Rune's ample rear end. "What?" "There." Hovis followed the direction of the mystic's gaze.
"Well now, Rune, I underestimated you."
Not 5 yards ahead, a ragged opening gaped in the wire.
"Congratulations,"
said Inspector Hovis.
"This way, men, and hurry."
Rune smiled and shrugged modestly.
"I am a man of my word," said he. "I am Rune, whose power is infinite, whose knowledge absolute. I wonder how that got there," he wondered.
The Hartnell aircar dipped away from the stadium with inches to spare and hurtled off into the night sky.
Now that was close.
Jim Pulley gripped the wheel, knuckles suitably white, face a likewise hue. The professor's head appeared above the passenger seat.
"Exactly how did you do that?"
he asked.
"There was a spare ignition key taped under the dash," said Jim. "That was handy, eh?" "Handy is not the word I would use, Jim."
"Do you ever feel, Professor?" Jim glanced back over his shoulder.
"That a power greater than ourselves is in control of our destinies?"
the old man asked.
"Something like that."
"It is a possibility the present circumstances might add weight to. You must definitely have a guardian angel, Jim."
"That's a comforting thought."
Jim settled himself back behind the wheel. The ancient scholar leant back in his seat. The teleportation of the key from Norman's ring to Pooley's hand had been a relatively simple matter, but it wouldn't do to tell the lad that.
"Drive on, Jim," he told the pilot. "Bring us about over the stadium."
"I'll do my very best." Jim had never been much of a driver, but whatever skills he might possess as a pilot were presently untried.
"Cool. Look at that,"
he said. Beneath them the stadium spread, acre upon acre, huge beyond imagination, a thing to inspire wonder and awe, if not a good deal more. Enclosed by the concentric circles of the stands seating for 1,000,000 people, so it seemed, the arena lay beneath a vast dome which shimmered in the moonlight. Towards the 5 star points, the Olympic villages rose like small towns. A futuristic skyscraper of tall towers, cylinders, domes and pyramids with raised walkways, practice tracks, thoroughfares and stairways strung between them. The panorama was fantastic, beyond belief, beyond possibility. It beggared description.
"It's a coker,"
said Pulley, very much impressed.
"Big boulder, this one."
"I have never seen the like,"
said Professor Slocum, staring with almost equal wonder.
"And I have been there and back again, as the saying goes."
Pulley nodded thoughtfully, as was often his way when lost for words. At length he asked,
"What are those, Professor?"
The sage followed the direction of Pulley's pointing finger.
"Both hands on the wheel, please," he said. "What those do you mean?"
Those is..."
Jim's attention had become drawn to the ranks of tall pylons, surmounted by silver discs which sprouted variously about the star points, like fields of high-tech mushrooms.
"The solar cells, I should suppose, Jim. They absorb the sunlight and project it from similar pads beneath the stadium to simulate sky, provide light, and create the visual camouflage."
"Thank you," said Pulley. "And so, where would you like me to park, as it were?"
Professor Slocum delved into his Gladstone bag and brought out a blueprint of the stadium.
Jim glanced back over his shoulder. "And how did you come by that, might I ask?"
"I stole it,"
said the professor in all candour.
I was far from certain that the television images told the whole truth about the stadium. I had this lifted from the offices of a certain Covent Garden design studio.
Pulley grinned and flew the car in sweeping circles above the stadium, humming gently to himself. His thoughts at present were unsettled, as he had no idea what might lie ahead. That he was going to buy one of these cars when he came into the big money was a certainty. As for now, getting through the night was rather high on the list of priorities. Another confrontation with Callerton was in the offing, and Jim almost felt comforted by the prospect. That was, he supposed, because his life lacked direction, that he should become Callerton's nemesis, even if he pegged out in the process, lent a temporary purpose to an otherwise pointless existence.
"You will pay,"
said Jim to himself.
"I do hope so,"
thought Professor Slocum as he studied the blueprint without aid of a torch.
"We will go down," he told Jim, "at the southern tip, above the river. Camp of the home team. I think we will avoid the Russian and American sectors. Don't want an international incident now, do we?"
Jim took his bearings.
"Ah, yes," he said. "The river, yes. I've got it, but where exactly? And,
he added as an afterthought.
"Yes. How?"
Professor Slocum folded the blueprint and peered out of the rear window.
"There are heliports, I see. But they have been constructed for vertical descent. There are no runways, and there is the matter of what will happen when you switch off the engine."
"Oh, yes."
"Well, we'll float up into the air again, won't we?"
"Oh, yes. I think the Hartnell air car is going to require a few more weeks on the drawing board. So what are we going to do, Professor? Bail out?"
"I'm not keen. Let us go down as slowly as we can. Steer it around this way."
Jim did as he was bid. They cruised down towards the camp of the home team, passing amongst the towers and pyramids, pinnacles and obelisks. At closer quarters, it all became even more fantastic and unbelievable, a science fiction landscape.
"How slowly can we go?"
asked the professor. Pulley changed down and applied the brakes.
"Quite slowly as it happens. It's quite clever, this, really, isn't it? The shopkeeper certainly keeps us guessing. Take us in, straight ahead."
The car dropped gently down from the sky, and although it continued to wobble uncertainly, Jim did an admirable job in controlling it.
"I have an idea," said the professor. "Can you take it in there?"
He pointed to where a broad walkway disappeared into the entrance hall of one of the curious buildings.
"I am not Luke Skywalker," said Jim, "but the Force is with us, I suppose." "Oh, yes, indubitably, Jim." "Right then."
Pulley eased back on the throttle, and in fits and starts they approached the opening.
"Please extinguish your cigarettes and fasten your seatbelts." "Now is hardly the time for levity. As soon as we are into the entrance hall, switch off the engine."
Jim was suddenly more doubtful than ever.
"But we will float up again, surely, and lodge underneath the entrance arch."
That, thought Jim, was as iffy a proposition as any he had yet known.
"In for a penny, then?"
The car bumped down onto the walkway with a squeal of tyres, bounced up again uncontrollably. The engine faltered and made coughing sounds. Jim gripped the wheel.
"We're going to crash." "Hold on tight, Jim. Now!"
Pulley slammed on the brakes, tore the key from the ignition, and made his personal recommendations to his maker. The car ground along a side wall, raising a stream of sparks and mangling metal, swerved, stopped dead, and almost at once began to rise. There was a sickening crunch as it struck the top of the entrance hall, and then a blessed silence.
"Bravo, Jim. You did it."
"I did." Pulley's face appeared over the wheel, nose crooked, a facsimile of the now mostly forgotten Chad.
"I did do it. I really did."
"Right. Now we have wasted more than enough time. To work."